Today I'm going to show you how to make pie crust. To make a pie crust, you have 4 basic ingredients. You have to have flour, water, fat, and salt. Flour and water form the structure, salt enhances the flavor, and fat tenderizes. To start with, I need 2 1/4 cups of flour. I already have 2 cups in this bowl, but I want to always remind you how to measure properly. So you use a scoop and pour into your measuring cup. Don't dip your measuring cup directly into the flour. And then level off. So now I have 2 1/4 cups of flour. I need 1 1/2 teaspoons of sugar. Now, not all recipes have to have sugar, but the sugar binds with the protein and helps to limit the gluten formation. So that's the purpose of the sugar. And I need 1 teaspoon of salt, which I've already measured. Then you'll just combine these together with a fork or a whisk, either one, but just combine your flour, sugar, and salt. And next, we will cut in our shortening. The amount of shortening that we're going to use is 3/4 cups plus 2 tablespoons. Now think, how do you get 3/4 cups when we don't have a 3/4 cup dry measuring cup? Let you think about that for a second. The answer is you need a 1/2 cup plus a 1/4 cup to get 3/4 cup. So I'm packing the shortening in, and you want your fat, no matter what kind you're using, to be as cold as possible. You can even put your fat in the freezer for about 15 minutes. Make sure when you measure your shortening that you pack it down, and then you'll level it off. And I am going to put this in the refrigerator actually to let it chill some more. So I have my 3/4 cup, 1 tablespoon, and I need 2 tablespoons. That will get put into the flour. While I have the fat here, we'll talk about the fat. Shortening is used, it's a pure fat, and it makes the flakiest crust. Butter and margarine have a little bit of water in them, so they tend to make a crumbly texture, but it is good for a tart. And oil is sometimes used in pie crusts, and it does make it tender, but it's more dry and grainy than it is flaky. So since you want a flaky crust, shortening is the best ingredient to use. Okay, now that I've had a chance for my fat to get cold, here's a 1/4 cup. Half cup. All right, use your pastry cutter to blend this in, and you're chopping the shortening up with all of the flour until it resembles a coarse sand. Sometimes people will say also it looks like small peas, but I don't think it ever really looks that big. It tends to look more like coarse sand. So you just keep chopping it up. You're chopping up all the fat into tiny bits and letting each tiny bit of fat get coated with the flour. You can also use a food processor to do this, but I want you to learn how to do it with a pastry blender or a pastry cutter. Okay, now you can see what it should look like. Whether you consider that coarse sand or small peas is up to you. And make sure that you've scraped off the bottom. Okay, the next step is our liquids. So here we have just our fat and our sugar, also, our fat and our shortening with a little bit of sugar that we use to help inhibit the development of the gluten, and our salt for flavoring. Now we're going to use, this is an unusual recipe because it calls for half an egg and vinegar. The vinegar, this is, in here I have 1½ teaspoons of vinegar, and that also helps to limit the gluten formation so that the pastry doesn't come out tough. But to get a half an egg, you crack the egg. Break the yolk. Mix it up. And then measure out 2 tablespoons to get, whoops, oh, I forgot, in this bowl, I forgot 1 of my tablespoons of shortening. Remember, we needed a ½ cup plus a ¼ cup, and then 2 tablespoons. I already had my 1 tablespoon in, here's my other tablespoon in. So I will quickly mix this in with my pastry blender. So we get that. But going back to the egg, you measure out 2 tablespoons as best you can. It's not going to be perfect. Just a little bit more needs to go in here, I would say. Then, so you have your 2 tablespoons of egg, 1½ teaspoons of vinegar is already in here, and up to a ¼ cup of cold water. Now, I literally have ice water, and I already have measured a ¼ cup into this cup. You don't use all of it. You can pour in about half of it at first. And let's see what that horrible noise is. Okay, so in this bowl we have not quite our ¼ cup of cold water because you don't want to add it all at once. Sometimes you don't need to add all of the water. Half of my egg and 1½ teaspoons of vinegar. And I'm going to go ahead and pour that over my flour and shortening and stir it with a fork just to combine it. You need to be careful when you're making pastry. You don't want to stir too much and overdevelop the gluten, which would make it tough. And you also don't want to use your hands because the heat from your hands will heat up the cold water and the cold fat, and if you melt the fat, then your pastry is not going to come out right at all. So you need to keep everything as cold as possible, which is why I use the cold fat and the cold water. And don't mix with your hands, really. You should just mix it together with a fork. Now, I left out about 2 tablespoons of my water, and I think this is going to be enough water. To test it, you pick the dough up, and if it sticks together with your fingers like that, then you have enough moisture in it. It is going to be very crumbly looking. So next I'll clear off my counter, put out some plastic wrap, and show you how to shape this into a disc. Okay, now I'm going to take my pastry and dump it onto the counter with the plastic on it. And one tip to make your plastic stick nicely to the counter is to just take a dishcloth and wipe the counter, and then the plastic will stick very nicely to the counter. So take your pastry and you're just going to kind of press it together into a ball. And then, because this is a 2-crust pastry, You're not going to cut it exactly in half. You're going to cut it so that one half is a little bit bigger than the other half. The bigger half would obviously be for the bottom of the crust since it needs to be deeper. So I'll take that other section of dough. And I also wanted to mention, with your other half of the egg that you didn't use, if you could share that with the kitchen next to you. So 1 and 2 can share an egg, 3 and 4 can share an egg, 5 and 6 can share an egg. So we'll take this over here to do. So now with this, which is going to be our bottom, I'm going to kind of make it into a flat disc, about a 5-inch round disc. Press it together. And then, if at all possible, you're going to refrigerate this for at least 15 minutes before you roll it. The reason for that is that will help to chill the dough, and it also lets it rest so that it won't shrink as much. So you'll put this in the refrigerator and let it rest for about 15 minutes if you can. All right, after you've taken your pie crust out of the refrigerator, unwrap it and put a little bit of flour on the top and a little flour on your rolling pin. And you're going to roll it out. You want to get it about 1/8 of an inch thick. And keep rolling in all directions. Roll from the center out is the best. And as you roll from the center out, lift up on the pressure a little bit as you get towards the edges, because naturally we tend to press harder when we get to the outside. So of course if you do that, then your edges are going to be thinner on the outside. So you don't want that to happen. So roll from the center out and lift up a little bit. Should reach the edges. Doing your best to get it into a circle. If your edges start to crack or it starts to become not much of a circle, just pat it back together. And continue on. If you need to reflour the rolling pin or the pastry, then of course you may. But do keep in mind you don't want to get too much flour added, because again that would change the texture of your pastry. We'll pause it here until I get it how I want it. All right, we're starting to get the crust, although it's thicker on this side than it is on this side, so I need to work on that. Also wanted to show you how, if you need to, for any reason, if you need to patch your pastry dough, you can always wet your fingers and then wet the dough a little bit and just take the extra piece of dough that you need to move around, pat it together, and that's how you can make any patches that you need to make. A little more flour in here. And then you really can't, you won't be able to tell when it's all done. So let me get a little bit more flour on here and continue to work this, get this side a little bit thinner. And you roll it until it's, like I said, about 1/8 of an inch thick, in the best circle that you can do. And you want it to be 1 inch bigger than the diameter of your pie pan when it's upside down. So I have about 1 inch. Of course, it's a little bigger over there and a little less over there, but I can show you how to fix that. So now there's a few different ways of getting the crust into the pan. One way is to fold the crust into into half or quarter. Another is to roll the crust up over your rolling pin. And another way is with two pans. So let's pause here and then I'll show you how to get the crust into the pan. First, I'm going to show the two-pan method of getting the crust into the pie pan. First, set your pan right down over the crust, centered as much as you can, with it sitting up like it should. Gather up all of your plastic. Flip it upside down as fast as you can. Make sure it's still centered the best you can do. And then peel your plastic off. Get your second pan. Oh, and actually also just kind of ease the crust around the edges. Don't stretch it. You want to ease it in there, allowing as much pastry to form around it as you can. You don't want to stretch it out thin. You want to kind of gather it in. Put your second crust on top, or your second pie pan on top. Flip it over. Remove your top pan, and now you have your crust in your pan. Now, this lifted up a little bit when I lifted my top pan off, so if that happens, don't poke the crust down because that stretches the crust and then it'll shrink when it's baking. So you lift up on your edge and ease the crust back down in. Ease it down in. Don't poke it and stretch it. Now, if the crust doesn't look here as beautiful as you would like, if it cracked a little bit, just wet it again, press it back together, and it's okay because we're going to make it look nice when we do our top crust, when we flute our top crust. So that's okay. Leave any extra pastry that you have, just kind of fold it like that. Don't tear it off and get rid of it because you might need it tomorrow. So then you'll cover this using your same piece of plastic. Cover it down tight. Put your period and kitchen number on here. Wrap it up and refrigerate it for tomorrow. Okay, and I wanted to show you another way of getting the crust into the pan. Even though I really do like the two-pan method, I wanted to show you the two more traditional ways. One way is to fold the pie crust, but I also have extra flour in here. I wanted to show you, if you do have extra flour, do try to brush it off before you use it. You fold your dough in half and then in fourths. Pick it up and try to put the point in the center of the pan. And then unfold your pie crust. And again, ease it down very gently into the bottom. Don't poke and stretch. Ease it down in. And with your extra, like if there's extra here, just push it so that it will lay nice and smooth and flat for you. And we'll go over fluting and crimping in a few minutes. Okay, the last method of getting the crust into the pan is kind of called the rolling pin method, and you'll roll your dough around your rolling pin. And then unroll the dough. So you can try whichever method works best for you. And again, ease the dough down into the pan. To make a one crust pie, you need to, there's a couple ways of preparing the crust. One is you can poke holes in the crust, in the bottom and on the sides. That helps to keep the pastry from puffing up, because you would put it in the oven like this without any filling inside. So if there's no filling inside, the pastry could puff up. So you don't want that to happen, so you poke air holes in it. The other way, if you don't want to poke holes in your crust, is you could put a piece of aluminum foil or parchment paper in the crust, then fill the crust with black beans, navy beans, to weight it down. So that's another way of, and that's called docking. However, right now I want to show you how to flute the edge. To flute the edge, you can the simplest is to just press down with the tines of a fork. That's the simplest. Not as fancy. And if you have extra crust, then at that point you can pinch it off. You can just kind of go right along the edge and break it off. Which that is nice, you can do that. Or if you want to get a little bit fancier, you can use your knuckles to make a V. And your index finger to pinch the dough between your index finger and your knuckles. And then just break off any excess dough. And then you have your extra pieces. If you need them, maybe you ran out of crust over here, you can use these to add it back in if you need it, depending on however you want to flute your edge. To make the topping for our apple pie, we need 2 tablespoons of flour, 3/4 teaspoon of cinnamon, 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg, and 1 teaspoon of cornstarch. Cornstarch is used as a thickener. It helps to make all the juices that are released from the apples, it helps to absorb them and thicken that up so that the pie isn't all watery. The flour also helps with that as well. And a 1/2 cup of sugar, of course, to add sweetness. So just pour all that together. Stir this up with a fork. And then this will get poured over top of the apples later on. To peel your apples for the pie, you can use a paring knife. This is actually a steak knife that I have in my hand. Just happens to be my favorite knife. But peel the skin off the apples. Of course, you could also use a vegetable peeler to peel the skin. As long as you've washed your apples, you could certainly eat the skin. Most of the nutrients are in the skin. Then cut down through the center in quarters, and then you can just pop out the core part. It pops out very nicely. These particular apples are Empire apples. As long as you make sure that whatever apple you buy is a baking apple. There's a large variety of apples that can be used for apple pie. If you go and check on websites, sometimes one website will say that a particular kind of apple is okay to use for baking. Sometimes you'll find a different website that says that apple is not okay. You don't want to use Red Delicious for sure, but Rome, Cortland, Empire, York, those are all good varieties to use for baking apples. The point is that you want to make sure that they stay in their shape when they bake and that they don't become all mealy. Okay, then you just want to chop your apples up. You can slice them. A lot of places will slice the apples so they're about 1/8 of an inch thick. That was a little thin. About that thick, and put them in like that. I tend to like to do just bite-sized pieces. It makes kind of a more rustic look. And then you need to cut enough apples. So, and if you have an extra pie pan, it's easiest. The recipes will usually tell you 6 to 7 cups of chopped apple. But the easiest way, is hard to tell how much, when you buy your apples, it's kind of hard to tell how much you're going to have after you've cut them all up. If you have an extra pie pan, I like to just cut my apples and put them in the pie pan and keep cutting apples until I have enough so that it's mounded nicely. I think maybe, these are pretty small apples, so probably I'm going to cut 2 more apples for this particular pie pan. Alright, once you have your apples mounded nicely in your pan, you know you're satisfied with the amount you have, make sure that you do want it to rise above the pan a little bit, but not a lot. If you have too much, then your pie is going to bubble over and make a big giant mess in the oven, so don't get too many. Then you'll take your apples, and because we are at school and we can't make our pie on one day, we will put your apples in a Ziploc bag. And pour about 1/2 cup of orange juice over them. And the reason for that is the orange juice will help to keep the apples from turning brown. So make sure you squeeze out all the extra air. Make sure you have your bag labeled with your period in kitchen. And just toss it around a little bit so that the apples get coated with the orange juice. And then put the bag in the refrigerator until we're ready for tomorrow. When you come in on day 2, you'll take your apples out of the refrigerator and you'll pour all your apples into a colander and let all the orange juice drip out into the sink. And just let it rest, drip into the sink until we are ready to put them into your pie. Alright, now that this would be what you were doing on day 2, take your bottom crust out of the refrigerator and dump your apples in that you've already drained. And then you're going to take the topping that we made, and you can just pour it over top. A lot of recipes, or maybe if you look it up online, it might show you to mix. What we could have done is had our apples in a bowl instead of the colander, and then dump the sugar mixture into the bowl and toss it around that way, but I never have. It always works this way. Either way works fine. Then you take 1 tablespoon of butter and dot it on the top. That's what it's called when you spread little bits of butter around. Okay. And now we're going to put the top crust on. And I just rolled this out. You might need to back up a little bit there, Paul. Okay. Okay. Peel off the plastic. And now, if it's not quite perfectly centered, adjust it just a little bit, and then we're going to flute it. Now, with all the extra crust that you have, I don't advise trimming it off until you really are sure you don't need it. So fold the top crust. If you have any extra, you really want to make sure that you seal in. If you have enough, you want to take the top crust and roll it around underneath the bottom crust, because you want to seal in all of the juices from the pie so that they don't bubble out and burn in the bottom of the oven, because then it really smells bad. So try to take your top crust and tuck it under the bottom crust the whole way around. I know it doesn't look very pretty right now, but right now we're just trying to get it sealed in. So I'll go the rest of the way around. Now, to go back, again, we can flute it. We could use a fork. If you do use a fork, I recommend not pushing down hard on the pan like that, because it tends to burn very quickly, and I just don't think it looks very nice. So if you are going to use a fork, just press as light as you can. Maybe use your finger to support it. But otherwise, you can, again, use your knuckles and your index finger to flute. And get a nice edge the whole way around. This actually, you can also do it with your thumb and in your fingers that way. Seems like that's going to work better for me today. Okay, now that we have the pie fluted, you do need to make sure that you vent the top of the pie so that the steam can escape without the pie crust actually bursting. One way to do it is to take a knife and cut down right through the crust and in a little bit into the apples. Some people like to make a star-shaped pattern when they do their vents. I like to just use a fork and poke holes into it. You could make a pattern if you wanted to carefully do your kitchen number. Just be careful not to make your hole so close together that your pie crust kind of falls apart. But just make enough holes so that it will vent. And then what I like to do is, if I have any spare dough, I roll it out and make a shape. In this case, I tried to make a little apple. And to make it stick, just wet your fingers, put a little bit of water on the bottom side or also on the pie. Press your little apple on. And I'm going to also, I'll squish together my very little leftover bit here. Fingers are too wet now. Try to re-roll it a little bit here. I'd make a leaf. Don't want my leaf to be bigger than my apple. Again, wet it. And also, I did kind of forget to say before that before I sealed my edges, my top and my bottom crust together, you do want to run water on your fingers and run a little bit of water around the edge of the bottom crust before you put your two crusts together. That'll help make them stick a little bit better. So there, if you want to do a little decoration like that, you can. But you do need to vent. All right, so now this is going to go into the oven, and we'll get to that next. Before you put your pie in the oven, if you want to give it an extra special touch to kind of make the pie a little bit shiny on top, you can brush it with milk. Gives it a little glaze. And then sprinkle with about a tablespoon of sugar. That was probably only a teaspoon was needed. So now we'll go ahead and put this. To put the pie in the oven, you want to set the pie on a jelly roll sheet or a cookie sheet and line the pan with aluminum foil or parchment paper. That way, if the pie does bubble over, it won't drip down onto the bottom of the oven and make a big mess. You put the pie in the oven for at 425 degrees for 15 minutes, and then you reduce the heat down to 350. After the pie's been in the oven at 425 degrees for 15 minutes, you reduce the heat to 350 degrees and bake for 40 to 50 minutes. Okay, you know your pie is done when it's golden brown on top. Now the pieces of foil that are on there, I put on to protect the crust, and I'll show you that here. Let me shut that oven. You put strips of foil over the crust in order to help keep it from getting too brown. And my little apple on top was starting to get pretty brown, so I covered it as well. And you can see the juices leaked out, and it's bubbling a little bit there, but it fortunately did not bubble over the pan, so we don't have to clean up anything out of the pan.